Well, welcome everyone. It's great to have those that are with us in person, those who are joining us online as well. My name is Pete Horsley. I'm one of the team at Remarkable. We're a tech accelerator and we're a venture arm of Cerebral Palsy Alliance, wanting to grow inclusive technology in Australia and around the world. We are currently on a Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This land was sacred. It's been cared for them for generations and generations. They were the original innovators, and we have much to learn from our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. So I pay my respects to anyone who identifies as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander here. Also want to pay my respects as well to advocates, disability advocates who have come before us, because I think that that we are where we are because of advocates fighting for the rights of people with disability. We still have a long way to go, but we have come a long way because of them. So we'll get to meet our other guest panelists, one who's zooming in from the other side of the world, as well as the two that are here with us right now in this room in just a little bit. But I wanted to give a little bit of a primer to kind of get our thinking kind of happening to begin with. Something that hopefully will kind of spark some ideas and perhaps spark some discussion a little bit later on as well. So diversity is the essence, or disability is the essence of human diversity. If we think about disability, it cuts across every race, every age, every sexual orientation, no matter what socioeconomic status you have. Disability cuts across all of those. And yet we kind of seem to be stuck in this situation where it's regularly placed into this kind of category of kind of put to the side. It is placed into a kind of area of niche. Oftentimes when I say that I work in the space of disability, people kind of metaphorically pat you on the head and say, oh, that must be very inspiring work that you do. It's kind of thought of as kind of charity and not for profit. And a space of sympathy, which I think is actually certainly something that it definitely shouldn't be. And I want you to do something right now. So wherever you are, if you're at home listening to this, you're in a workplace listening to this, I want you actually to pull out your phone. I want you to pull out your phone and I want you to hold it and look at it or feel it if you're not looking at it. I just want you to feel it. Don't taste it. I heard as I was doing some research around this, it actually said that our mobile phones are usually have more bacteria than a toilet seat. So just a little kind of fast fact for you right there. But I want you to look at your mobile phone. So welcome, people. Welcome. It's so good to have you here. Pull out your mobile phone. I want you to have a look at your mobile phone, because in that piece of technology is some incredible technology that was first not designed for the majority of the population who are currently using it. So in your phone, you use something called a keyboard. Now, the keyboard is different from what it was originally designed as, but Pellegrino Turini was one of the first inventors of the keyboard. There's actually a love story at the beginning of the typewriter. So he was speaking to Countess, I want to get her name right, Countess Fattori, who had started to go blind. And he fancied her, he kind of loved her and wanted to give her a way of being able to write love letters. He actually hoped that the love letters would be written to him. I'm not sure how that story ended. I was telling my wife about this last night. She's like, you can't do that story without saying what the ending is. I do need to do some more research. But he developed a way of creating a keyboard so that someone who was losing their sight would be able to write legible letters. That is in your phone. The second thing is the keyboard. The phone itself was actually one of the first inventors of the telephone it's noted as Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander's mother was profoundly deaf. His father was actually an educator of the deaf, And then he also was married to someone who was hard of hearing as well. And he was trying to figure out ways that we could perhaps, he had a real fascination and interest in acoustics and audio, and was trying to figure out ways that he could potentially allow his wife to be able to communicate or hear better. The other thing is SMS. Here's a fast fact for you. 5 billion people around the world have access to SMS now. That's 65% of the global population have access to SMS. First designed actually for some students who were deaf to be able to communicate with each other. Again, this is something that's baked into this little device that you and I carry around every single day. And then the last one is the internet. A man, and those of you who've heard me talk a couple of times before will know that I'm a big fan of Vint Cerf, who is one of the originators of the internet. Vint developed profound hearing loss at about the age of 11 or 12. And then as a researcher was trying to figure out ways that he didn't have to pick up the telephone to speak to his research colleagues, and also his wife, who was also hard of hearing, trying to work out ways that he could pass data over to her. And so created some of the earliest internet protocols that are the building blocks that we have of the modern internet today. All of these things, as you look at that phone, as you kind of gaze at this little device that we pick up somewhere between kind of 100 and 300 times to check it per day, all of these things actually were originated in a space that was potentially designed for people that are outside of this, that are beyond the people in this room. And so why then do we have this situation where if it's thought of as niche, it's thought of as the space of kind of charities and not-for-profits, and yet we have 1.5 billion people around the world. About 20% of our global population has some form of disability. And we end up with statistics like these. 2/3 of the working population, 2/3 of working age people with disability are not employed. $1.9 trillion of global GDP lost every single year. And that was a stat from 2009. I haven't updated it since then. It is most likely a lot higher than that. We have these statistics around kind of where we're up to. And 900 million people who need one or more assistive devices in the world don't have access to it. Why are we in this situation? We've got to reframe some of our thinking about this. And so that's why I'm excited to have this discussion today. And I'm excited to kind of think about areas of inclusive design. There was a study that was done in 2011 where it was trying to look at car crashes, and it was looking at people who identified as female who are getting more injured in similar car accidents to people who are identifying as male. And they're trying to figure out what was going on. And they soon figured out that it was because the crash test dummy was actually based on a male body size and type, whatever they thought that was. And so it wasn't until just even 10 years ago that we actually started to have adjustable seatbelts that allowed for different body shapes and body sizes. Crazy thought. Back in World War II, Lieutenant Gilbert Daniels was only 23 years of age when they were trying to figure out why all these planes were crashing in World War II. And he did a measurement of literally, took measurements of 4,000 pilots. And can you guess how many of those 4,000 pilots actually perfectly fit the dimensions of the plane that was designed for? Literally zero. Zero, not even one, literally zero. And again, that ended up being the result of having to think about designing for the edges. Let's think about designing for the diversity of human experience, not just designing for kind of one particular shape, or adding that as an afterthought kind of afterwards. So I guess from this, we can say there is no normal, there is no average. The end of average has already happened, right? We have to think about the diversity of human experience. We are all shapes, we are all sizes, we are all socioeconomic, have socioeconomic status. We all have different literacy levels, we have different tech ability, and we have different disabilities as well. So as we kind of enter into this, it's not about one size fits all. It's not about saying that, we have to kind of create something that does one thing for everyone. It's about kind of thinking literally about inclusive design that aims to create products that work for the most number of people. And also that we need assistive products that are designed specifically to meet certain needs that perhaps the whole population doesn't need to have access to. So that's all I wanted to kind of give as a bit of a primer. I think that hopefully we've got some of the right people in this room to have this conversation, but also some of the people that are joining us online. So you will have the opportunity to kind of submit some questions as we go on. But to kind of start this next section, I want to introduce the amazing Mel Tran to everyone. Mel's going to moderate this session and introduce us to the rest of the panel. And I'll just give some words about Mel, first of all. She's an incredible individual that I got to know about 2016, I think, when she was part of a startup at that time, Ability Made. She's gone on to become an incredible user experience designer and speaker and writer and doing further study, and just found out today, published author coming out next year as well. So an incredible individual, and I'm so glad to know you, Mel, and I'm so glad that you get to moderate this session with us today. So over to you.
Thank you, Pete. Pete, I might have to bribe you with a cup of coffee after that for the intro.
I need one.
For those of you in the room and for those of you who are joining us through the World Wide Web, thank you for being here. We really have an amazing lineup of speakers today, and I'm really excited for you to get to know them. But we will do a short round of intro shortly, but just a disclaimer, for those who know me, know that I never shut up, and especially since I've prepared literally 10,000 questions for each of you. So, Pete, I give you the permission to shut me up so we have enough time to give the audience to ask questions as well. Afterwards, before we do an intro, I do want to do a warm welcome to Eloise, to Pete, and thanks to the beauty of technology, we have Noel joining us from New York. Hey, Noel.
From the windy Alps.
Let's start off with a round of introductions before we dive in. Noel, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, my name is Noel Joyce. I'm a wheelchair enthusiast and industrial designer. My background, previous to the work I've done, that I do now, and I've done previous to this work, I was in the Irish military. I had my accident roughly 17 years ago, leaving T6, T7 complete, paralyzed from the chest down, and I went back to college to study industrial design. I've had a number of startups myself, which I developed as a result of understanding was going to be quite difficult to get work in design, maybe as a disabled person as well. And as a result of that, I went on then to work at a hardware startup named Hacks. One of probably the first hardware startup accelerator based in Shenzhen in China, where I led the design team. That's not a grand gesture, by the way. I was the only person doing design for a very long time, so I led the design team. I've worked with at Hacks maybe 2 to 3 startups on various types of hardware, anything from consumer electronics to robots to medical devices, anything you can think of, and an industry you can think of. I've probably worked on a technology or a product in that area. And I would always specialize in trying to turn or change technologies that have never been used before in the way they were being used, or new technologies, into customer-facing or consumer-facing objects and devices. After that, I went on to start to teach at NYU. So that's why I'm in New York. I'm teaching design and innovation at New York University, where I get to sort of hand over some of that learnings I've had over the last 13 years to the next generation coming up. That's me. Sorry for going on a bit. Thank you. Thanks, Mel.
Thank you, Noel. Eloise, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Eloise. I think I was introduced to the disability diversity sector from a young age. My mum is a diverse learning needs teacher, so I've always been sort of exposed to diversity, starting off with neurodiverse, and also an industrial designer. And for my honours, I was looking at co-design methodology and working with amputees to look at how we could design prosthetics that not only considered physical rehabilitation but also emotional rehabilitation. And I think coupling mechanical engineering alongside emotional design seemed like such a natural connection, and that's something I'm really passionate about, linking people to the designs that they are going to be using. So that's something I've continued to work through, and got great experience where I met Mel and Pete through Centre for Inclusive Design, where I got to meet many people of different abilities and diverse backgrounds, where I learnt that bringing people to design is the most important part of the process. So now working at Vert Design, which is industrial design consultancy, I get to bring that knowledge that I have into practice through to the manufacturing stage, which is really exciting.
Thanks, Eloise. Last but not least, Pete.
Pete Horsley is my name. I'm part of the team at Remarkable. Philippa is also part of the team at Remarkable. So we're investing in and growing disability tech-related startups, both here and in America as well, and in different parts of the world. So I've been 17 years at Cerebral Palsy Alliance, and I actually have a background in design as well. So it's great to be with you all.
Thank you, Pete. I think each of you all bring such a unique and powerful perspective to the topics of design, tech, and innovation. So I'm really excited to pick your brains on some questions. But Noel, the first one is for you. And as an innovator, as an educator, you've got extensive experience in the industry. But I'd be curious to know, what are some of the challenges that you've experienced with implementing inclusive design principles in your work?
Okay, so that's a doozy. When I think about, I think everyone in the panel sort of understands my opinion about what I think about inclusive design, right? But I think about the challenges of having a disability myself, and being involved in the design work that I've been doing, gave me a sort of unique prism through which a different sort of level of empathy came from, right? So when I think about what I'm doing, the work that I'm doing, I think a lot about the human experience, whether it's for able-bodied people or not, right? What am I trying to get to? What am I trying to tackle? One of the things I think that, if I was to think about the challenges, I suppose it's trying to get the message across that this is something that's of use to everyone, right? When we design for disability or the extreme circumstances, it's going to help everyone, right? Because again, I've talked quite extensively about the idea that we all end up disabled. It doesn't matter who you are. You're going to end up disabled whether you like it or not. So there's going to be a point in your life where you don't want to feel like that you have to change to suit the circumstances of the products and experiences and infrastructure around you, and the world starts to close in, right? And right now, I think we have a unique opportunity through understanding disability and utilizing disability as a means to understand our future selves. So when it comes to the challenges, I often found I was coming up against not coming up against people, but coming up against, I suppose, opinions that it was a thing that we'll add that later, we'll think of that later. But when I flipped the story to being a selfish reasoning for engaging, if I tell you that you're going to be disabled, you're going to think differently about it, right? So that sort of the challenges to me were always, right, okay, how do I change the story to how do I inflect it that it affects you as much as it affects me, and getting around those challenges. But I think, Mel, I can probably speak for you as well, where we're pretty adept at problem solving, right? So I think that I've utilized my disability to be able to be a better problem solver, be better at coming up with solutions, whether they're for just regular products or for people with disability. Yeah, and I could probably talk even more than you, Mel, so I'll stop now. I hope that answers.
I think one of the really interesting things that you've just shared, Noah, and the stories that you've shared earlier, Pete, I think there's a common ground there around how lived experiences and barriers and challenges that every individual face is a driving force for innovation. And that's exactly why we're here today. And I think, Eloise, you've also got a lot of experience in the education sector, but also at Vert Design, and just the values that you hold just as a industrial design designer. I think we're also quite familiar with the discussions around the medical and the social models of disability. I'd love to know, from your perspective, how can we leverage education as a platform to help create a shift in mindset from the medical model of disability to the social model?
Thanks, Mel. I think that shift in mindset is going to be where change is going to be made and implemented. I think having the medical model, which is looking at people with disability adapting to suit an environment or a product, is where the problem sort of starts. If we sort of reframe to the social model, where we're not getting people to adapt, but we're getting environments and products to adapt, there's going to be a much stronger connection. I think, so part of my background as well now is teaching at UTS, so I get to, from where I studied, get to teach some of the students in product design, and I think I always bring the inclusive design methodology into their practice, and I want to share as much as I can. I think when it comes to situations where it's unknown, and there's always fear of unknown when you're designing for someone and their lived experiences that you can't interact with, it's really about framing it in a different way. So I think we can leverage education and framing so that there's more opportunity to ask questions and look at how we can develop products to suit more people. I think the social model really allows people to empathise, because I think the biggest barrier is not understanding and not knowing how it can impact you. So to Noel's point, if you say everyone in their future will experience a disability, whether it be arthritis from old age or something else, they can then see how their designs will benefit everyone in the future. So I think it's really about reframing from an ethical point of view, but also an empathy point of view.
That's great. And I think one of the things that you both touched on is just that fear of the uncertainty of asking the questions, but also just, I think, how these lived experience can shift our own individual perspectives. And I think it is safe to say that, because if you're not, it's easy for someone to say we're not exposed to disability, and we don't know someone who has a disability. So it's easy for us to say, oh, that's too hard. Let's take a step back and just stick to the safe space. But we also know, and it's one of the things that came up a lot today already, is that the barriers and challenges of our own lived experience can be a driving force for innovation. And one of the unique things about our society right now is that I think every one of us right now, whether we're in this room or online or just anywhere in general, we all have a collective experience of living through the pandemic, and we have all experienced the challenges that come with it, and we've all been forced to adapt and to embrace the uncertainty and the change that comes with it. Pete, I would love to get your thoughts on how you think we can use our collective experience of living through the pandemic to create a more accessible future.
Yeah, it's an amazing question. I think one of the first things that comes to mind when you posed that question was the rate of change that we were actually able to do when the pandemic hit. My wife is a teacher, and she was saying, like, they literally had to kind of snap into action around schools and being able to educate kids online, and there was a whole bunch of kind of challenges around that. There's been many within the disability community have been calling for kind of more flexible working conditions for decades and decades, and we're always told, no, sorry, it's too hard, can't happen. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hit and we could do it within the space of almost 2 weeks. And you think, okay, well, that is possible. We each kind of shared in some of being inhibited or being kind of trapped in our homes. And so I think that before we kind of go too much further, it would almost be good for us to kind of reflect on what that experience is like, to be able to kind of consider perhaps what not being able to access other locations might be like, what being told that you are kind of forced into kind of complying to kind of certain ways of doing things is. Having said all of that, I think that none of us can ever fully understand anyone else's experience, and so I think that what we should try and do through this experience is perhaps try and build our empathy muscle, get better at listening, ask people how they're going. I think your point around fear before, is a really valid one. Like, people are scared to say the wrong thing. They don't want to offend other people. And I think that's a valid fear, right? But the only way that you're going to actually bring some change to that is to chat to someone, chat to James, chat to Mel, like chat to other people that have different experiences of disability. Yes, we might say the wrong things from time to time, but I don't think that should be a barrier to stop us in engaging in conversation. So yes, we have had a collective experience. Yes, we've got some things to learn from that, but I think we've also got to continue to hear, continue to listen, continue to build our empathy muscles.
Can I just add one thing, Mel, to the COVID sort of isolation period and Zoom sort of being utilised a lot more for meetings? I think there was the visibility for more people to see accessibility considerations, so things like closed captioning or just having captions in general. And I think that visibility really benefited the broader community and us as a society. So I think that's something, if you want to look at silver linings, I think there was more of a push towards accessibility because it became a necessity. So I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's just interesting to see how you both mentioned, especially touched on, just how fast we can change and adapt when we are forced to, when things don't work. And I think there's initially that level of resistance. I mean, if you think back to pre-pandemic and you think about the concept of work from home and the remote working or even telehealth, the resistance with privacy and security and all the concerns. And yet once we're in that situation, and what you have said earlier, Pete, around when you're forced to think about what it feels like to have this, I guess, autonomy removed from you, then you start to think about, well, how do I make this work? How do I work around it? And then we start to think about, I guess, when things don't work the way it should or the way it could, then how do we innovate and adapt? And Pete, I think you touched on a really interesting point around education and how things changed so fast when you had no other choice to. So I'd be really interesting. And we know that there's a lot of changes in the way we work as well. So Noel, I'd love to get your thoughts on how you think we should embrace the change that has happened so far in the workplace during the pandemic, to embed inclusive design principles in education and life in general.
So the first thing I would sort of, to echo all the comments so far, in 2019, before the pandemic even hit, I did a talk about how people with disabilities, again, I got to talk about how me and other people with disabilities are awesome because we are great problem solvers, right? And how technology at that point in 2019 had enabled surgery, brain surgery, to occur with a 3,000 kilometer gap between the person performing the surgery using a robot and the patient, right? This was before pandemics even came into our lives, right? So the technology exists to be able to work remotely before the pandemic came along, and it existed, and it was able to do things like that, right? So I often think about, if we were to take the collective intellectual horsepower of people with disabilities as problem solvers and give them those opportunities with those technologies before even a pandemic came along, you're already sort of thinking about what the future is going to be like. The pandemic, I suppose, gave everyone a taste of it, and we're all going to talk about how now you know what it's like to be disabled to some degree, but we shouldn't have even had to do that, right? We shouldn't have had to do that. We should be embracing the idea that there's this massive untapped resource, and now we have the technological capability to release it, right? That it's not because of the pandemic that we should try, but because we've got these two incredible resources that could be used, right? So that's sort of my thoughts on the whole pandemic thing, right? And I would have used the pandemic as a great way to tell that story too. But what my biggest learning from it was the ability to move in the built environment after things started to open up, the ability to do things that you wouldn't have done before, the fact that you don't take the same risks. Like, so going to a cafe, for example, the 2 meter distance thing meant that there was space to move around. You could get into a place that you couldn't get into before. When you went to the doctor, you didn't sit in a waiting room with 10 other people who were coughing and spluttering and all sorts of stuff. There was a system developed that prevented you from getting any worse than you were when you went to the doctor, right? So all of these things that became benefits add a certain amount more value to our lives. And the only thing I fear is that we will go a little bit backwards just because we think we need to pack more people into a space, just because we want to, make things more efficient, and we could end up with bad circumstances. But I think I think it's a little bit different for us nowadays, again, because of technology, that we can be constantly reminded of a situation that will occur almost instantaneously. Whereas I suppose in other pandemics years ago, it would have went past, and we would have sort of begin to forget it very quickly, right? I'm making an assumption there, but it's not the same as the way we can get information straight away. So I think we're a bit more clued in at all times and a bit more aware as a result of those things. So I see positives, but I believe that the positives of how we needed to educate or talk about these things were there before the pandemic, well before, because the technology and that intellectual horsepower exists.
And it's amazing, I think, that you've mentioned that all the talk of inclusive design and just in general, it all should happen even well before the pandemic. And this is, right now, it's a unique opportunity to change, but it's also, it should happen well before this. And hopefully it will also spark a conversation. The conversation that we have today will go beyond this room and into your day-to-day work as well, to keep that momentum moving. But I know there's a lot of conversations around why we need to be more inclusive, the power of diversity, But Eloise, I'd love to get your thoughts on what are the risks when we don't embrace inclusion and diversity. What happens as a business, as an organization, as individuals? What are the risks that we would experience?
I think when we're not actively including people, we're actively excluding people. And I think we've seen so many instances, you know, you can look at it from a humanitarian approach, you can look at it from a monetary approach, you know, even something as simple as having to then retrofit designs to suit people that they weren't initially designed for. As you mentioned with the car and the aeroplane sort of design, they were designed around standardized anthropometric data. And I think that that's where sort of the issue lies. So I think designing for adaptability and flexible use is what I sort of champion, and that's what I sort of echo in my design and discussion. But I think the risks can be excluding people, and I mean, when you mentioned that untapped market that we have, when you were looking at sort of the data and the statistics from 2019, it just shows what we're missing out on as a broader community. I think the risks are, you know, it's partially ethical, but also just, I mean, value. To me, when I look at these sort of things and I look at inclusive design, I'm just like, it's common sense. And I think that's why, like, whenever I like talk to people or I start to talk about the social model, they're like, oh, that makes so much sense. Like, of course this, you know, sidewalk should be designed with a curb cut. It'll benefit not only a wheelchair user, but XYZ people as well. So I think, you know, if you look at risk and then you look at opportunity, the opportunities are always going to be where you should lie responsibility.
Can I add to that as well? I think, you know, we've kind of glanced around a couple of kind of big topics, and I totally agree with you, Eloise, that, you know, if we haven't got all the brains on some of the big challenges that we're actually dealing with, then we're cutting ourselves short. Like, if we're kind of ignoring a bunch of talent that could potentially bring some solutions to this, to Noel's point, like, we're still dealing with climate change, we're still dealing with kind of concerns around mass migration. Why have we got people kind of having to leave their homes and move places? We've got all these really, really deep kind of both philosophical and physical challenges before us. And if we go, well, let's just put like half of the squad onto that, like, you kind of go like, we're missing out on the brain power who actually come with natural kind of problem solving ability around that. So I think it's essential for us as a society going forward that that we bring the full bench squad of everyone on this.
To like sort of summarize that, it's almost like untapped innovation is the risk. Yeah. Sorry, Noel.
You know, I was going to just mention, like, when we talk about that, right, what's been left on the table, right? And one of the projects I worked on in recent years, Pete, you would know about, was when we looked at mapping footpaths from the perspective of a wheelchair user and gathering the data around vibration and impact in order to be able to help create a solution that let, you know, local governments repair areas that needed to be repaired, etc., etc. And when I take that example project and look at ground delivery robots, right? Those very same things, those things that are going to do the last meter delivery, need that information. So there's a whole, like, that's a good example of how there's all this information that we're not utilizing based on the difficulties that people living in the built environment have, right? And by looking at it from that perspective, we're putting value on the table. We're not just costing money to solve those problems. We're going, okay, and now Amazon can actually efficiently deliver stuff. Now they're probably going to pay higher taxes in a specific area because their robots operate there more frequently. Now we're employing people with disabilities to map areas to help those robots understand where they can go, right? And that's just like a small cross section of all of the things we could be looking at. And that's just like a small cross section of all of the things we could be looking at. And that's just like a small cross section of all of the things we could be looking at. that can help both people with disabilities, but also the general public. Imagine the idea that someone in a wheelchair managed to help get your delivery to your house. That's the kind of power that's there.
First of all, I think innovators, you also, one of the things that stuck up to me was untapped innovation. I think we need to hashtag that. Yeah. Hashtag worthy phrase. But I think what all three of you have mentioned is around creating opportunities for individuals to thrive and to exercise our empathy muscle, but also to bring unique and diverse voices to the center of designing and developing products and services, but also just in the way we work together and collaborate. Pete, this one is for you. Do you think, from your perspective, are there any businesses or organizations that are doing well in the space of creating a platform for voices to be heard and to embed inclusive design in their work?
Yes and no. So certainly there's businesses that are starting in this space. There's been companies like Apple that have tried to take an approach around this kind of for a number of years. Google and Microsoft are doing something similar more recently. And certainly they wouldn't be approaching it from an altruistic perspective, right? Like they know they're going to make some money out of this. But there are aspects of kind of businesses working on this problem that it's only kind of certain pockets of the business or it's certain aspects of the business, and we haven't actually seen it dive all the way into our hiring processes, our HR processes, our marketing messages. Like there are little kind of pockets of things kind of happening through some of these kind of big enterprises, but it really needs to kind of find its way all the way through businesses. And I actually think that the businesses that are doing this best is actually startups. It's companies that are kind of, we've got some startup founders in the room, and I think that they're actually kind of have seen an understanding of this. Like Hayley's kind of doing this right now in her business, that she's seen kind of the untapped kind of value that can happen around that. So I think that, have we seen some businesses that are doing it well? We've seen some businesses that are doing it partially well, I think. But where my hope certainly lies is are the startups that are kind of now emerging. They're emerging businesses, and they're going to be built with this DNA kind of embedded into them.
That's amazing. And I think that itself is almost a whole panel discussion on its own. I do have one last question before we hand it over to the audience. This is a question for everyone on the panel. I think we all can agree that we're all responsible and accountable to help shape a better future that's more inclusive and diverse. But what's more important is that we all have the capability to do so, no matter what industry that we're working, whether it's tech or disability or education or communications or marketing or finance, and it just goes on. But I guess I'd love to get thoughts from the panel around what are some of the strategies that we can implement in our day-to-day work that would help contribute to the broader vision of rebuilding a more inclusive and diverse society.
Go now.
I can go first. Yeah, I think we have to make. Well, we don't have to make them. We have to help people to understand that this is your future, anyways, right? The day that you start to slow down, the day that it gets more difficult, is going to be there. The problem for all of us, whether we like it or not, is that we don't like to believe that there's a fallible version of ourselves, and it slowly creeps up on a lot of us. Some of us have got there well before everyone else, and that's why we understand. why these things are important to solve, right? So I think if we can think about that idea of the future self, that's one strategy I think about a lot. The second one is to think about it from a business perspective, because with the best and most altruistic reasoning for anything that you do, if you do not make money from it, no one who has money is going to be interested in doing anything about it, right? And one of the things we did recently was Nike's new Fly Ease shoe, where it became so successful. It was designed for people with disabilities, but became so successful that not even the people it was designed for could get a hold of it anymore, right? And Nike didn't turn around and do that because they were doing something nice. They understood that there was an opportunity here, and also that the future is more difficult for a lot more people. So I always think about that as an example where, Nike own the way you will put a shoe on in the future. And if they're not thinking about that, if they're not thinking that far ahead and looking at disability as a way to drive those innovations, then they're going to miss a lot of value. They're going to miss a lot that they could realize today, but also realize in a longer term scenario. And to speak to the startup idea, the startups that Pete mentioned as well, this idea that the startups are the ones that these large companies are going to be interested in, right? Because they're lower risk opportunities to understand problems. Instead of betting the Nike betting on themselves to solve these problems, they're probably looking at 20 different ideas now that are disability startups, that because of the success of that single product. So there is a hunger and an appetite. It just might not be talked about as specifically for disability right now. And I think if we don't talk about it, that's fine. But as long as we're sort of thinking about it in that way as well, right? That there is a huge business opportunity here to give long-term value to your organization as much as help people, right? That would be the way I would think about it. Make people realize it's going to happen to them and that they must do something about it now because they can make money from it.
If I can build on that as well, I totally think that Noel's making incredible points here around the value of data around people with disability, that we need to get better at understanding that and reporting that as well. So as I kind of look at some of the world, a bunch of the hypothesis that Remarkable we have as a kind of program is that technology is one of the ways that we're actually going to see some of these barriers broken down. I think policy is obviously another area, and that's a really, really slow-moving beast that will still need to happen. But then the other area is this kind of area around data, which I think is a really interesting one. And at the moment, I don't think we've got data presented in a way that is compelling enough to enough businesses. And so we need to be able to serve that data up in a way that businesses go, oh my goodness. So in the UK, they talk about it as the purple pound. There's been people that have tried to kind of put some numbers around this of the buying power of people with disability and their close family and friends. There was something that came out, I think EY did the report, and it was about $13 trillion globally. That's just too big for people to comprehend. So I think we've got to bring it down to kind of some kind of further levels of understanding what does that data mean for my business. And we're actually working with an entrepreneur at the moment who's blind, and this is her business. She wants to kind of bring the value of data to the mass kind of enterprise kind of consumer base, I guess, business base, to be able to report that in a way that they can then harness those insights for the betterment of their business and do the things that Noel's just talked about to actually grow their businesses.
I think strategies can be at a policy level. They can also be at a really small scale individual level. So something my boss Andrew says a lot, usually in the context of sustainability, but he says progress, not perfection. And I think that's something that I keep echoing each day. And I think it's the same for inclusion. As yourself to be nice to yourself as a designer and say, each day, how can I continually include more people and through what methodology? So I think that idea of progress in day-to-day and acknowledgement of small wins is a really important step in a broader sort of shaping a more inclusive future. Yeah.
I love that. I love that you've all touched on strategies that you can implement both from a top-level policy development perspective and while that's happening, what we can do in parallel with the day-to-day work that we do from a grassroots level as well. And I think there's so much to unpack in that. But I would love to leave this to the audience. I believe we have a Slido question happening. To take a couple of questions from the audience.
We just need to share the Slido on the screen.
Okay.
Anyone in the room that has a question, we have a microphone, so we can do that here, and then online people will do that.
Easy.
Got a question at the back. So, no, question at the back. Yeah.
Hi. It's more an observation than a question. I think the stuff that you were touching on in the end there, Peter, about the fundamental structure of innovation and the business model that we have for dealing with innovation in the disabled space is actually very, very underdeveloped. So I think we have all these really interesting concepts around social model and medical model and all that sort of stuff, but we haven't really developed our technology model to the point where we can really say, look, this is how it works, this is why it works, and this is how you can make money out of it. So we're relying on heroes and startups and the odd random success here and there, rather than a really systemic approach to it at a government level. And you look at Australia, every week each of us put 10% of our wage into this huge fund, which then goes and invests in ANZ Bank. Who needs more ANZ Bank investment shares? If they just took 1% of that whole bucket and put it into a fund for that had really good technology base behind it, really good business model, we could actually transform the thing. And so that's the policy level that I think we really need to be fighting at.
I love that.
Any other questions?
Do we say it?
Yeah, we'll grab it. We'll grab the microphone just so that we can.
Yeah, it's a similar sort of theme, but it's a sort of more philosophical kind of idea. I've heard these. Again, it's sort of these ideas where, let's say, for instance, in some countries where you've got a high population of elderly, that there should be this sort of almost like a gift of time. So if people have to go and donate hours that they spend with the elderly, so that you build credits, so that later on in life you end up having whatever you've given back, and you'll have people kind of coming and looking after you when you're old. Like, it's a big question to throw at the panelists, but like, is there something like that within the disability realm? It doesn't always have to be just financially driven. Obviously, it's great if it can be, but is there something like that where we can kind of develop whether it's like hours of volunteer work or time, or using your specific knowledge or experience to invest early, so people have to then, in a similar way, invest in the overall disability world going forward?
Yeah, bizarrely, I know about, there was an organisation, I can't remember the name of it, that was trying to, and there was a number of centres around the world that were trying to do something quite similar to that, where essentially you gave what you could give, but an hour equaled an hour equaled an hour. So it didn't matter if you were an architect or if you were kind of collecting someone's garbage. It was whatever you were able to contribute, you could then barter that with other kind of people within that kind of realm as well. And it was kind of talked about as like, this is kind of where the next wave of volunteering could go. and I haven't heard much about it since. That was probably about 10 years ago. So, but yeah, I don't know if others have heard of other kind of similar
Yeah.
systems. But yeah, go.
I was going to just say, sorry, jumping in there, what is the thing that people with disabilities value hugely? And Mel, I don't know if you feel this way about it. For me, it's independence, right? It's the means to be able to do these things or manage yourself in most circumstances. I don't need someone to do it for me. I just need the means to be able to do it myself, right? And that's why, like, I think that investing in ideas and technology and understanding disabilities means that not only do you make the capabilities available for people with disabilities, but you do it for, you don't have to give the hours back to people when they get old then, because they're more independent for longer, right? We end up having solved the problems today that enable people to be more independent for longer. Like, I'm sure that a lot of us have cantankerous parents that won't accept help, or they don't want this, or they don't want that. You know, if more of the things that we have to use for our everyday lives in the future are less, have less barriers, then we'll have gained those hours ourselves by looking at disability today to create those solutions.
Right. Any thoughts from you, Eloise?
Oh, I think that's a really interesting, like, sort of philosophical comment. You know, my brain's sort of ticking, thinking it over. I think if there were to be a main benefit from that sort of transaction and interaction would be exposure and then deeper understanding, because I think deeper understanding comes from interaction. So I think the main value there would be a broader understanding in the community. Yeah.
I think we need to find a business and have this conversation with a business and get them involved in this discussion and have them help create the solution, because businesses need examples to follow from. And this is such a broad topic. ESG doesn't have the word disability in it, but we talk about ESG every single day in corporate governance. So there's a huge gap just in language alone. So maybe we need to find a business who is open, very proactive in various things, but bring them into this conversation, firstly to educate them on what we're talking about, and then maybe have them help us understand what it looks like from their lens, because our problem isn't necessarily their problem. But unless we have that conversation, it may not be able to be bridged. So I think that's probably something that we could work on.
Yeah.
And happy birthday, by the way, Peter.
Oh, shush.
Oh my God, Pete.
I threw that one out there.
I think it's an interesting one because, and again, not the birthday bit, but the if you don't have an example, I think that's a really, really critical one. So we need to kind of point to examples that are existing now, but we also need that kind of greater, I guess, it needs to be built further into businesses. But also, I think that, we have reportables for ESG now. And while I know that there certainly is a kind of division of thought around, do you have to have kind of some numbers around that? We're now talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, but we don't talk about accessibility on top of that. And I think that oftentimes when you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, disability is actually forgotten about a whole lot of the time. And so we need to include accessibility into that kind of framework as well. And actually, if you rearrange the letters, it actually becomes IDEA then rather than DEI. So that's not mine. I got to give credit to someone to Jonathan Kaufman in the US on that one. But I honestly do think that we need to kind of add that element into this kind of DEI conversation.
Just to add to what you're speaking about, Pete, one of the things that came up in a lot of conversations recently that I'd been part of was the cost of inclusion, right? If you were to look at the spectrum of what we say about inclusivity, where like if you want to include people of different sexual orientation or race or whatever it might be, right? How people identify themselves. The cost of inclusion, the barrier is less than when we think about disability in a lot of circumstances, right? And that's why I think the conversation around how businesses can benefit from the situation, that's why I keep going on about this idea that there's this untapped potential, this ability that you're not realizing just because you're not including it, right? That if you gave it a while and tried to include it, maybe you're going to realize value that you that was far and away beyond what you thought. Like, I mean, if we look back at even the few months of the year where we've got different types of like we had Disability Pride Month. Did it get anywhere close to the same level of attention as Gay Pride Month, for example, right? Was there the same level of interaction and we say advertisement even about how companies supported disability the same way as the month before? Nowhere near it, right? And I think that it's the cost of inclusion and the fear of that inclusion that slows the whole process down. And I don't know if that's going to change at a policy level or not. But it's like, that's again the reason why, and I think it's true, we need to find those examples. But the examples are there to be taken advantage of. I think they're already there. We need to build them. We need to execute on them and put them front and center. And it'll take a little bit of time, but it's I suppose just that we need to have that belief to go forward. Like I don't get to talk to you today if I didn't believe that there was opportunities in some of the things that I did to even get to hear and be talking to you guys, right? So I think that, you know, I see a bright future for all of it. I don't see the same barriers, I don't think. But maybe that's because I'm too ignorant to understand when I'm beaten. And we'll just keep going, you know.
Eloise, did you want to add something before we wrap up?
Yeah, just as well, I think part of it's communicating the business impact, like the positive impact to businesses. I think that's what a lot of us through our day-to-day and work are trying to do is, you know, whether it's selling it into a corporate level, it's presenting the opportunity. So even if we look at the figures of unemployed people with disability who are unemployed, and I think there's a direct correlation between that and then the inaccessibility of businesses and the way they function. Because I know, Pete, you mentioned before, even the recruitment process not being accessible to, say, someone who is neurodiverse. So I think it's about framing it in an opportunity sense. I think that's a big thing that we're all trying to do, and I think there needs to be more of that.
I know there's certainly been massive themes around that came up in these conversations today, and I know we haven't gotten around to all the questions, but I really hope that the conversation today is just the beginning of sparking some creative juices, and also just to challenge everyone here today, everyone virtually, around what you can do in your day-to-day work to help bring us as a collective that one step closer to the vision that we're all working towards. It's a massive thank you to Noel, to Eloise, to Pete, for sharing your wisdom, sharing your story. For those of you online, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoy the session. For those of you in the room, we have the next half an hour to socialise, to make new friends. And tip, if you want an autograph or a photo with any of the speakers, now's your chance to strike. And bonus, if anyone decides to do a song and dance to wish Pete a happy birthday.
Oh, no.
Thank you, everyone. Round of applause for the panelists.